Hi, welcome to this presentation from the Clinical Translational Research Infrastructure Network of the Mountain West region. We are representing the pilot grant key component activity, and this presentation is an attempt to provide current investigators across the region with information about how to apply for a pilot grant application through the CTR-IN. And also for people who are considering such an application in the future. My name is Curtis Noonan. I'm a director of the pilot grant key component activity of the Mountain West CTR-IN. I am an associate professor in epidemiology in the Center for Environmental Health Sciences in the College of Health Professions and Biomedical Sciences at the University of Montana. A lot of my research is focused on environmental epidemiology and population-based research. I also, as part of the COBRE-funded Center for Environmental Health Sciences, I direct the pilot grant program for that center as well. Here with me to share in this presentation is Associate Director for the Pilot Grant KCA, Bill Shuttleworth, and I'll give him an opportunity to introduce himself. And throughout the presentation, he and I will be sort of shifting back and forth on some of these topics.
Thanks, Curtis. So as Curtis said, I'm Bill Shuttleworth. I'm a Professor of Neurosciences here at the University of New Mexico. My own research is more basic science and translational science in neuroscience, looking at brain injury and recovery from brain injury. Like Curtis, I'm involved in other pilot programs. So I'm in charge of a pilot program for another COBRE here at UNM. But also relevant to this program, I'm Associate Director of our Clinical and Translational Science Center, which has a very similar pilot program to develop specifically clinical and translational research. And that's one of the reasons Curtis and I are working together to try and bring some of those experiences to this new CTR-IN program.
Great. Thanks, Phil.
Thanks.
So to give you an idea of what we'll be discussing in this particular presentation, we're going to start out describing the goals of the pilot grant program, and then get into some understanding of the specifics of the application process itself. And then importantly, I think for individuals that are looking to prepare a pilot grant application, we're going to talk about what the reviewers, or how a review process works, and what the reviewers would be looking for when they're reviewing your pilot grant applications. So to start out with, and talk about the overall goal of the pilot grant program, of the CTR-IN pilot grant program, we hope to improve health outcomes in our IDEA communities via fostering nationally competitive clinical and translational research by early career and established basic science investigators at Western IDEA institutions. I'm going to pause here briefly to apologize for the the use of acronyms. This is a federally funded program, so not surprisingly, we have we do use acronyms. And so when Bill or I say CTR-IN, we're referring to the Mountain West Clinical Translational Infrastructure Network program, which is comprised of not only our pilot grant component, but also education and mentoring component, and as well as the epidemiological and biostatistics support component. And similarly, we'll use the term KCA, which refers to the key component activity. And then, as you can see in this slide, we use the term IDEA. And so there's a bill we'll discuss a little bit later about which states are involved in the IDEA network. But all of the partner institutions of this Mountain West CTR are part of the IDEA network. So back to our pilot grant program and our overarching goals and guiding principles. One of the main features or goals of the pilot grant program is to support investigators across the network in engaging in high-quality research. And a key aspect of that for this pilot grant program, and frankly for any pilot grant program, is to create opportunities for investigators to generate the key pieces of preliminary data that will guide and support a subsequent extramurally funded larger scale research project. So the whole goal of this is to support the investigators in our region in in developing a track record and the key data that's necessary to lead them forward to seeking and being successful in competing for extramural funding. We also are interested in promoting a broad spectrum of clinical and translational research. As in a moment, Bill will describe sort of what the sort of broad scale of clinical translational research. And our particular group, CTR-IN, is not restricted to any specific type of clinical and translational research. So we welcome all different variety of such work. We're also very interested in career development. This is goes hand in hand with our collaboration between the Education and Mentoring Corps and the pilot grant support of pilot grant funding for investigators is just one piece of the puzzle in terms of building and supporting future career development of CTR researchers in our region. To the degree possible, we also are interested in supporting cross-disciplinary research. That is, something that is highly valued among NIH program staff and also scientific reviewers to tackle the important health problems of our day with a multidisciplinary approach. So we hope to, by being able to branch across numerous institutions, we hope that investigators will have an opportunity to perhaps identify collaborators that have expertise that may not reside at their specific institution. Similarly, we are interested in developing cross-institutional collaborations, and where this can be very important for researchers engaged in our Mountain West states, when we are dealing with clinical patient population research or general population-based research, we are often engaging in clinical settings or in communities that have sparse populations or lower numbers of individuals with which we can engage research. So in order to accommodate that problem or address that problem, we hope to be a bridge between institutions and between communities so that investigators can expand their geographic reach of their investigations. And finally, to that very end, what we hope to do is to foster investigators to address health-related issues that affect rural and vulnerable populations in our regions. So I'm going to hand it over to Bill, who's going to talk a little bit about eligibility, both from the investigator level and in terms of what is defining what CTR research is.
Thanks, Curtis. So to re-emphasize something a point Curtis just made, this is really about generating new extramural grants. So a lot of emphasis here is on which PIs are eligible. The first thing is that they have to be part of our network. So they need to be a faculty member or someone who's eligible to write a grant and submit to an institution such as NIH. So this map shows our network. This is based, as you know, at UNLV, but involves these Mountain West states connected by these dotted lines. This map is from the NIH website that shows the other CTR-INs that are currently in operation. So to be part of our pilot program, the PI must come from one of these states and have a faculty position. The other criteria are really related to the investment that's being made in these individuals. This has got to be someone that the university is interested in supporting and developing a new clinical and translational program. There's a requirement that the PI is able to devote 20% effort to the research in the project. That's that's a minimum. It would be great if they were able to contribute more, but that's a strict criterion. There must be only a single PI for each of these grants. That's important because this program is actually quite difficult to manage. If you can imagine the headaches of negotiating all the contracts between Office of Sponsored Projects at all these different institutions, that's pretty difficult to get done quickly within the time frame of these one-year projects. So it becomes infinitely more difficult if there are subcontracts going out between multiple Office of Sponsored Projects. So we ask for only one PI per project. We do, however, really support collaborative projects, particularly those that involve multiple of our Mountain West states. That would be a big positive. We're interested in career development of junior investigators who are setting up new programs. That's obviously a great use of pilot funding. However, we're not discriminatory. We will definitely encourage and support projects from established investigators who are making a significant change in direction into clinical and translational research. The people we're really thinking about here that would be a big asset to this program are basic scientists that have a strong track record, know how the NIH system works, but may not have had access to clinical samples or populations in order to move into a translational project. So again, there's no restriction on career stage. We're interested in young investigators setting up programs and established investigators in new directions. There's a very important detail here that if you already have funding from another IDEA program, you cannot apply as a PI or get any support from this pilot program for a pilot project. Curtis mentioned the IDEA program, so this is these are two programs, the IMBRE and the COBRE programs. You may be aware of two other programs that run in parallel with the CTR-IN program. They also have significant pilot and project funding. And again, if you have any project support from those programs, you cannot also ask for CTR-IN support. So the last criteria here is institutional support. We'll touch on this again later, but it's important that each institution is able to make an investment to support the development of a new program for each of these pilot applications. The next big question that we really want to address today at this point is the research eligibility and the big question of whether the topic of your research is suitable for CTR-IN funding. So to be funded by this program, this is very specific. This is just for clinical and translational research. There are many other programs available that support preclinical research, and this is not to say preclinical research is not something that we value very highly. It absolutely is. Most of my research program is indeed preclinical, and you absolutely need fantastic preclinical research before you can even think about developing a translational or a clinical program. But this program does not support preclinical work. What it does support is clinical research, which is defined as shown in this slide. This is traditional patient-oriented research that might be done in a clinic or in a hospital. This also includes, very importantly, epidemiological and behavioral studies and outcomes research and health services research. Again, the emphasis here is on patient contact or contact with patient data linked to outcomes. And if you're curious about these definitions, there's a website listed here that provides the NIH definitions for clinical research. So we will fund anything that's clinical research for sure. The question of what is translational research is a more complicated question. What we're doing is adopting criteria that have been developed and refined here at UNM following the NIH guidelines for translational research. This slide shows one good definition of T1 to T4 research. It identifies at the top what we all agree is very important: basic science research, preclinical and animal studies. That is can be very important for relating to the next steps, but it is not in of itself considered T1 research. Some definitions include that as T0 research. That is the first phase of this spectrum, but it is not funded by our CTR program. T0 preclinical animal research is not funded. We do fund T1 through T4 research, and as defined here, they are the steps that move preclinical studies into the clinic. This is the first studies that test whether a basic science finding or an animal finding can be moved into a patient population. T2 research is generally defined as the translation from clinical research to patients into practice-based research, and then T3 into practice, testing what issues modify the applicability of results that are defined in a small group of patients into larger clinical practice. And T4 is the movement of these research findings into changes in global health. So again, for our program, we will not fund preclinical work. We're really looking to develop T1 through T4 research through our network. If you submit a project that has a combination of preclinical and clinical research, that may well get reviewed, but administratively, at the end, we will have to cut out any funding for any component that's not clinical or translational. And that's a very important point to make today. So I'll hand it over to Curtis to talk to you about actually how to apply for this program.
Okay, so this is just a brief discussion of the mechanics of the pilot grant program and the application process before we get into sort of the review considerations. Our application process has grown, evolved over time. We're now wrapping up in the second year of our program, soon to enter the third year of our program. And so what we have changed in our process, the largest change that we've implemented is having a nomination phase whereby each of our partner institutions will nominate up to 4 applicants to be considered for submitting a full pilot grant application. So that process begins sort of in the late fall and the late spring through the winter, and the nomination packets are submitted to CTR-IN sometime in very early winter. And then after a brief review of those nomination materials, and I'll describe in a moment what the components of the nomination packet include, after a brief review by the pilot grant KCA, we offer invitations to eligible applicants to submit a full application, which will be due later in the spring, March, April. And then when full applications are received, those applications are forwarded to our external peer review group, and we do a very it's very difficult, but we do a fairly good job of matching up reviewer expertise with the topic areas of the pilot grant applications. So when we receive the scores from the external reviewers and the critiques, our next step in our process is to go through review, discussion, consideration by our advisory boards. We have both an internal advisory board committee, which is comprised of vice presidents for research and similar persons from each of the partner institutions. We also have an external advisory committee, which includes individuals from outside our Mountain West region. And then finally, in this final period of June, those awards that are or those applicants that are recommended for funding, there will be a process where the administrative office from the CTR-IN will be requesting and obtaining materials from those applicants in order to put together a package that then has to get forwarded to our program office, the NIGMS program office, which oversees and funds our CTR-IN. And they are the group that provides the final review and approval for funding of pilot awards. So that process happens in June, July, with an earliest start date for a 12-month pilot grant would be in July of a given year, and then that pilot grant would continue through June of the following year. So that's just a brief overview of the timeline for our pilot grant process. So a little bit more on this nomination stage, which, as I said, is sort of a newly introduced part of our program. And the purpose of having this nomination from each institution is to support a couple of goals. One is as a way of demonstrating institutional support of the investigators that are put forward for nomination or consideration. As Bill mentioned earlier, institutional support is a key important factor of our network, and it helps to grow our entire network and our future CTR-IN and strengthen our future program. So the demonstration of institutional support is a key feature of that nomination stage, and that is provided, as I'll show you in a moment, in the form of a letter from a chair, a dean, or vice president for research. The other key feature of our nomination process is that it allows us the opportunity to really improve our peer review process, and it's gone fairly well in the past, but by limiting the number of applications that we receive, it allows us to have more reviewers per application, which just gives us an opportunity to provide applicants, both successful and unsuccessful pilot grant applicants, with a much richer critique and feedback for how they can improve their future applications. And another nice feature of this nomination stage is that it allows the pilot grant KCA, Bill and myself and others, to provide some early feedback to the pilot grant applicants. If we, for example, if we see a particular aspect of a proposed research that might call into question whether or not the overall research direction it would fall under the rubric of clinical translational research, we would engage in a dialogue with that investigator just as a caution and just to make sure that they are fully aware of administratively what is considered clinical translational research within the context of this program. So the elements of the nomination packet are several, one of which is an NIH biosketch and other support so that we can see confirm that in fact the PI is eligible to apply for this program and doesn't have conflicting funding sources. We also ask for a one-page summary of proposed research, which is one of the more challenging things that any researcher does, which is trying to distill and communicate the goals of their research and what they're trying to do into a very small one-page summary. This is best presented as a specific aims page, and in a little while Bill will show a structure of a specific aims page and what a specific aims page is trying to communicate. IRB status, this is another important component, and I'll talk a little bit more in detail about that in a moment in terms of addressing issues of feasibility. The letter of institutional support I mentioned, this is just primarily to demonstrate that the institution is supportive of this particular investigator's application, and a mentor letter. This brings into play one of the very important aspects of our CTR-IN program, which is operated via the Education and Mentoring KCA, and that is to identify senior mentors for pilot grant investigators that can help them not only in designing their pilot grant research project, but also projecting forward how they can help in building their career, their trajectory towards being a future successful CTR investigator. So now we're going to get into a description of what the reviewers are looking for when the pilot grant application is submitted. Three main components that we'll be discussing in a little more depth are the scientific merit, quality of the research plan, project feasibility, and then also probably something that's probably of greatest importance is the probability that the pilot grant proposed will lead to new extramural funding for CTR, clinical translational research. So for starters, what the reviewers are looking for and how they're scoring and how they're providing their feedback to the pilot grant applications, we follow the NIH, the standard NIH criteria for and instructions that are provided to members of scientific review panels or study sections. And so reviewers are asked to score the following components: significance, innovation, investigator, approach, and environment on a scale of 1 to 9. And you can see how those numbers break down in terms of whether or not the research is considered of high impact, medium impact, or low impact. And the impact score is the reviewer's overall determination of how important the research is, and in the specific case of our pilot grant program, how likely it is that this pilot grant research proposed by the investigator will generate the key preliminary data that's needed for a successful future extramural grant application. So as you look at the components here, the significance, innovation, and approach, those parallel the sections of the research plan that would be presented in the presentation. And admittedly, that can be a challenge. We restrict the allowable pages on this section quite a bit more than what you would be allowed to present for a traditional NIH application. And so it is challenging, and being able to squeeze the approach into a smaller page within a smaller page limit. But that's also an important aspect of good grant writing, and that is where communication with the pilot grant applicant's mentor can be extremely important. Investigator, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, about how important it is, how the biosketch is important, how other collaborators are important in terms of giving the reviewer a sense that the investigator has the strength and capability and support to conduct the research that's being proposed. So I mentioned mentoring and the mentorship core. The other essential component of the CTR-IN is the epidemiology and biostatistics KCA, and that KCA is really essential in providing quality biostatistical support for prospective pilot grant applicants, both at various stages, and so that includes when the pilot grant applicant is proposing and developing the pilot grant application and research plan. It includes biostatistical support for actually conducting the research and engaging in the data analysis aspects of that research, and subsequently in building the subsequent research approach and plan, including power analysis and data analysis methods for that larger scale future application. And to that end, each of our partner institutions has a biostatistical expert that will help each investigators in providing those services. So that is a key aspect of the pilot grant application process, is engaging with that biostatistical support early and often. And as I mentioned already, the education and mentoring core is essential for helping to identify the best mentor to help a prospective pilot grant applicant. You see here a link to follow that can offer some tools to help identify an appropriate mentor for a researcher. Okay, now I'm going to transition over to Bill, who's going to talk a bit about the writing the application approach section.
Thanks, Curtis. So I think the key here is that the reviewers that we have for these projects are savvy NIH reviewers. Most, if not all of them, are active or recently active on study sections at NIH. So they're used to looking at a specific type of grant written in a specific type of way that's successful. So what we want to do for the next couple of minutes is to go over a little bit about what that format is. Many of you will be very familiar with this, so but really we want to give everyone the same information. So if you're not familiar with this process, I would recommend this book. This is the Grant Application Writers Workbook. This was produced a number of years ago and updated quite recently when they changed the NIH study section format. It's available on Amazon and other places. It's quite easy to find, and I would really recommend reading this book cover to cover if you have not submitted an NIH grant before. It's a terrific guide. One of the things this book does is tells you what happens in the room at a study section, which will be quite similar in some ways to what's happening with our pilot program, the things that people are looking for. But it also spends quite a bit of time helping you with the structure, including things like making a very clear specific aims section of your grant. Curtis made a good point that our application format is compressed compared to a full NIH submission, but the specific aims page is still a one-page specific aims page that should look very familiar to our reviewers. This workbook does a good job of saying what reviewers look for in that. They look for a few things. They look for a very clear description of what the gap is, what the gap in knowledge is that your research is going to address. They look for a logical objective from which you would generate a hypothesis, and then some very clear specific aims that follow from that logical stream. And then at the end you should tell them, if this all works, what's the outcome and how does this meet our goals? And so this workbook shows very clearly step by step how to generate this type of structure. You won't be able to read this, but on this slide here's an example of a specific aims page written in that format. It has a paragraph at the beginning that's really the setup that says, in this case, what the problem is with stroke and what needs to be done about it, what's missing right now in the field. Then it says what the goals are for our specific project and why that's logical based on this gap, why this is the next essential burning question that needs to be addressed. The aims then follow logically as what we're going to do to address these goals. We finish with a summary paragraph of what's the impact if these goals are actually achieved. Will this be meaningful? There's a lot of research you can do. The question of this page is to say what should be done first and why is this the most important thing ahead of many other applications that might be doing more perhaps pedestrian or types of research. So this is really where you catch the reviewers' imaginations. If this page is good, the reviewers will tend to read the rest of the application and look for ways to support you and to say, well, this is a great idea, how are we going to help them refine it perhaps and make it better? And I think quite bluntly, if this page is not good and doesn't do this job well, reviewers tend to look at the next pages as, well, how am I going to scuttle this grant which I don't understand or don't think is important? So one view is that this page is the key to your application, and if you can really spend a lot of effort with your mentor or others that are experienced NIH grant writers to get this page right, the rest of the application should follow quite a lot more smoothly. So, as Curtis said, one of the points for feasibility is really, for NIH grant reviewers, is the idea good, but they also look very carefully at the investigator team. They look to see whether the investigator has the track record and the qualifications to carry this project out to completion rigorously and deliver a good product. It's a tough world out there, and many of you who are applying for NIH grants know this very well. But if you haven't, the funding rates at NIH are low for new grant applications. So you have to convince them that your idea is good and that you can do the job brilliantly. So that's a piece of the feasibility question that reviewers will be looking at. They'll be looking at, in a year's time after you've collected these data, will your biosketch and track record stack up with others in the big pool at NIH study section to be successful. So we would suggest paying a lot of attention to that in your application. Many of our applications might not yet have an extensive track record of funding in a field. So this is something you can address head on, and you should address head on in your application. You can do this by making good use of the personal statement section of the biosketch to describe what your career trajectory is, and explain why this is an important step towards your career goals and establishing an independent program. And if you do have perceived gaps in your publication record that might be considered weaknesses for federal review, then address that in your design of your study by recruiting others into your team that can fill gaps that you have in your resume perhaps, or others that might complement what you've done to make it a strong overall team that will stand up well on the national stage. So we would encourage you, if this might be an option, to seek good co-investigators that might be able to work with you on a project you would still remain the PI, but perhaps you need a more experienced investigator in some cases to add some confidence from the review panel that there's expertise and experience in this area. So while that's a good approach, with your co-investigators, we would caution you to pay attention to this map. The funds from our grant can be spent only within the IDEA states. This is an IDEA program. CTR-IN is part of the IDEA network. So the funds must stay for salaries, particularly, within these states. So you can pick a co-investigator that might have complementary skills and provide some salary support to them if they're within one of those states. So that's one small point to keep in mind. You're also greatly encouraged to attract as many expert consultants as might help your project. That's a great thing to do. Consultants aren't always paid. If they're not paid, they can be from any one of the states or anywhere in the world for that matter. But if you're going to consider salary support, make sure that it stays in an IDEA state. So I'm going to hand back to Curtis to discuss important issues with IRBs.
Yes, IRBs, among other things. And so when we get into some of these details of an application, sometimes they're perceived by some as these sort of annoying or time-consuming parts of an application and one prefers to spend, appropriately so, the majority of their time focusing on the research approach, the research plan, the specific aims page, building the appropriate investigative team. But these components are essential for a couple of reasons. One, they address the issue of feasibility, and so if, as Bill described, if if a particular reviewer is not convinced by your specific aims page, they may look to some of these elements as areas where they can scuttle, to use Bill's phrase, an otherwise good application. The second reason that these elements are important are that we, as with any NIH-funded project, these elements have to be included in the packet that goes forward to our program office at NIGMS in order to obtain approval to release funds to the investigator. So what are these elements? Describing how one is going to obtain the patient samples, the patient records, if that's appropriate, the biological samples, access to populations, how that is all going to work, the mechanics of that even. And so an area where one can address this partly is in the protection of human subjects section, because you are limited as an applicant to this program, limited on space in terms of approach. You can address this in the very detailed or very prescriptive section called the protection of human subject section that requires each applicant to address very specific elements of their approach and where that impacts human populations and human participants. So that area is a nice area where one can describe further how an investigator is going to access, through what collaborative network someone is going to access particular samples or patient populations, if that's appropriate to your application. IRB approval, a related point also included within the protection of human subjects section or addressed therein. And this is, we can't overemphasize the importance of this, of starting this process early, interacting with your institutional IRB, or where, and in some cases perhaps that requires interacting with multiple institutional IRBs or IRBs that reside at specific communities with which you are engaging and interacting. It's extremely important to, by the time the application is submitted, to clearly indicate that you have IRB approval to engage in this research. Again, it's just another factor that reviewers could be looking to identify weaknesses for a given application. because of the time scale of these pilot grant applications at 12-month, which is fairly fast, we as a program cannot afford to allocate resources to a project that is going to require multiple months before IRB approval is in place. So that really needs to be tackled up front before funding is awarded. The planned and targeted enrollment table, this is sort of a reflection, so it's another element, another sort of detail of the application, but it's really important to match that to the part in the research approach that describes the justification, the reason why a particular sample size was selected, and that, of course, is a number that's derived in consultation with your biostatistical expert on your team. So that's I already mentioned the protection of human subject section. It's an important, sometimes neglected part of the overall application. So this brings us to the third key feature, and this is when we transmit the applications to our assigned reviewers. We provide them not only with the classic instructions that an NIH reviewer would receive in terms of scoring according to the criteria and summarizing their critiques, outlining weaknesses and strengths for different components of the scoring criteria. We also ask them to comment upon and consider in their overall impact scoring whether or not the application convinced them that this pilot grant project is going to generate the key preliminary data. And I know that we sound like parrots when we say this, but this is the key element of the program, whether it's going to generate that key data that's going to lead to a successful next step in seeking extramural funding. So as part of that, and part of the responsibility of the pilot grant applicant is to communicate that, to not just present what you're going to do in this 12-month pilot project, but also how, even within that 12 months, you as an investigator are working towards developing your future directions, your future aims. And so including, for example, in your timeline, not only the aspects of your approach for the pilot project, but also within that timeline, how you're going to start developing your future grant application, and then even going as far as identifying, is appropriate in some cases, a specific funding announcement that you're targeting to apply to after you're done with the pilot project. And then the final element here in terms of demonstrating potential, the likelihood of success down the road is as Bill described, it's important to identify that in your biosketch and your personal statement, but also important is defining who your investigative team is, not only for the pilot grant application, but for the subsequent application, and how that team as a whole, and it's appropriate in some cases, perhaps not appropriate in other cases, but how that overall investigative team is going to be a successful, look very polished and have a good criteria score in terms of investigator when the future application goes forward to an NIH study section. Budget, and this is again one of those details of writing a grant application. But again, a detail that is essential and important, because the reviewers do look at budget, and they do look at how, is one allocating the dollars available for this pilot grant program? Are they allocating those dollars in an efficient way, in an appropriate way, and are those dollars allocated in a way that makes sense in terms of actually accomplishing the goals? So seasoned NIH reviewers are very savvy and usually have a pretty good sense of whether or not a particular allocation of budget items is appropriate for a given proposed research project. Bill already described how the importance of maintaining the funds. This is a programmatic requirement. The funds remain within the IDEA network. And then this is an element often, we talk about direct costs versus indirect costs, or F&A cost, and for the purposes of this pilot grant application, all the partner institutions that are part of this Mountain West CTR have agreed to allowing a 10% F&A or indirect cost rate, which is extremely generous on the part of those institutions, and it's a really important factor in terms of demonstrating to our program office at NIGMS that the 13 partner institutions really have a stake in the game and are putting forth resources for this overall growth or the overall goal, excuse me, of growing CTR in the region. So we thought we'd leave you with just a summary of our recent history of the pilot grant KCA. You'll see here that we've broken this down into different columns, and in our first year we actually had 2 rounds of pilot grant applications, and as you can see, we received lots of interest, starting rather small and slowly, where only 5 of our partner institutions had submitted applications to receive pilot grant funding, but we corrected that in our subsequent round within the same first contract year of our award, and we got involvement, engagement across all of our originally 11 institutions. We now consider all 13 institutions. So in our previous rounds, University of New Mexico and University of Hawaii were ineligible for this pilot grant funding, but we have since changed that. So all 13 of our partner institutions are eligible, and that is reflected in our current round of funding. I'll point you to one highlight here. In round 2, you can see that as the information on this program was disseminated and people became more aware of these opportunities, we got more and more interest, which is fantastic. That's exactly what we are looking for. To some degree, we were somewhat overwhelmed by the response in our most recent year of pilot grant applications and funding. So, receiving over somewhere in the order of 97 pilot grant applications, which led to challenges when it came to getting sufficient numbers of expert reviewers with appropriate topic expertise to review and score the applications. So that brings us to round 3 and our sort of new process, whereby we have a nomination stage that allows us, as we talked about previously, not only to have each institution have some say in which investigators are going to be put forward as investigators that are promising that the institution will support in terms of generating future CTR investigations, but also it enables us to have a more a stronger peer review process that allows us to to have more than 2. So we're going to have 3 reviewers for each application in this upcoming round. So we're looking forward to that process. It's going to allow us to generate a great deal of important feedback to both successful and unsuccessful pilot grant applicants, and that's what this is all about: is moving the ball forward, sometimes incrementally, and sometimes in great leaps and bounds. Finally, I'll just leave you with our web page, where you can go to see any new funding announcements that come forward from our pilot grant KCA, also information about the pilot grant program overall, and as always, you're welcome to contact Bill or myself. Our emails are here, and we're happy to respond to any questions, concerns, or direct you to appropriate individuals within the CTR-IN network that might be able to answer any questions or provide the support that you need to be successful. So with that, we thank you, and we look forward to receiving your applications.
This educational offering was supported by the National Institute of General Medical Sciences of the National Institutes of Health under grant number 1U54GM104944-1A1. The content is solely the responsibility of the authors and does not necessarily represent the official views of the National Institutes of Health.